From the Spec Network, this is Fragmented, an Android developer podcast where we talk about building good software and becoming better Android developers. I'm Don Felker.
And I'm Kaushik Gopal.
Welcome to the show.
This episode of Fragmented is brought to you by American Express, and I'm here to let you know that their Android team is hiring. If you love the idea of working in a team which values testability, customer experience, and proper Android UI design guideline support, all while getting things done right the first time, well then, my friend, keep listening. The Android team at American Express prides themselves on shipping a high-quality experience to end users, all while implementing the latest and greatest technologies at hand. For example, what about Kotlin? Yeah, they've been using it for 2+ years. It's what we write in every single day. Design patterns? Yeah, they got you covered from UI patterns to typical Gang of 4 patterns. They've seen it all, and they know when to use the right tool for the right job. Well, what about testing? Like integration, functional, and unit testing, you might be wondering. Ha, you're in luck again. They have a huge test suite that is run on every single PR to ensure that no regressions are hit. Now, those are going to be functional, integration, and unit tests, and so forth. And get this, you're given the time to write the test to ensure your changes don't break anything and ensure your changes work. Yes, you're given the time to write your test. Now, let me go off script here. How many companies are happy that you spend extra time writing tests? Well, probably very few. I can't count many on one hand that have been happy with me spending more time writing tests. They probably wanted to, or you probably wanted to, but you just needed to ship the code faster. Well, American Express, they know that getting things done right the first time matters, and testing is paramount, which means that quality is paramount. Now, maybe that sounds a bit scary because you've not written a ton of tests. Well, you're in luck then, because the team at American Express is full of fantastic folks that will help mold you into becoming the best version of your current self when it comes to developing professional Android apps. And here's another great thing about American Express. They support you for being part of the community. Now, for example, do you want to speak at conferences? Totally, they support you. You want to build your writing skills on the tech blog at americanexpress.io? Go for it. Again, they support you. What about contributing to open source? Again, they support you. Start writing that open source. If you want to be part of the community in any way, from speaking to coding to running a user group, etc., you guessed it, they'll support you. And finally, they get the whole work-life balance thing. It's not a myth. The benefits are great, and you're not required to work 80-hour weeks. And well, to tell you the truth, that just makes life a lot easier. How can I say this with so much confidence? To tell you the truth, I've been working with American Express for over 2 years now, and I've seen this all firsthand. So if you're interested in coming to work alongside of me, follow the link in the show notes and be sure to tell them that I sent you. I hope to see you around.
I also want to thank Nevercode, our sponsor. Nevercode is a continuous integration service for mobile pros. It's that simple. The company was born from a very simple idea: help mobile app developers build better apps faster. The service helps developers build, test, and deploy both native and cross-platform mobile applications. They do this automatically without any human interaction. And you all know, I usually love that. Always trust our machines to do the mundane tasks. The humans can do the more interesting stuff. They also strive to make sure that you have less configuration headache when using the service. But here's what's really cool about them. As a mobile-first CI service, Nevercode is taking the Flutter revolution extremely seriously. They now support projects exclusively built on Flutter. If you have a Flutter project, they provide a pretty kick-ass CI for Flutter, so definitely give them a shot. Now you might be thinking, well, what we have kind of works. Do I really need a CI service? Is it worth it? Nevercode has gone and analyzed more than 75,000 builds. They did the math and calculated that their product saves up to 20% of developers' workday. Think about that for a second. That's about 10 weeks per year. I'll paste a link in the show notes to the blog post where they talk about this in some detail. CI is a must-have these days if you want to build a professional, stable mobile app. And if you want to give Nevercode a shot, head on over to nevercode.io for a 14-day free trial. They also have a lot of good resources for mobile app developers on their blog, nevercode.io/blog. So you should definitely check it out. Thanks again for sponsoring today's show, Nevercode. All right, Don, we are back. You've been an indie developer for some time now, right?
Yeah, in one form or another, definitely for as long as I've been developing Android, yeah.
That's awesome. So one of my good friends from long back in my wedding party days, he also embarked on an indie project, and I thought today it would be interesting to like get him on the show as well, and so we can talk about one of the things that he's working on and how he'll be moving forward. So without further ado, I want to bring Matt onto the show. Hey, welcome to the show, Matt.
Hey, Kaushik and Don. I'm really happy to be here. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, thanks for hopping on the call, Matt. We really appreciate you joining us here.
Yeah, of course.
Incidentally, I think all of Don, you've like worked with Matt before too, right?
Yes, I have at American Express. I worked with Matt for a while, so we have some camaraderie already built in as well.
So Matt, can you, before we actually start, can you tell us how you got started on Android, and just give like for listeners who haven't heard of you before, can you maybe give us like a quick rundown on how you got started on Android, and give the listeners an idea of how you got started?
Yeah, of course. So I've been doing Android since about 2013. I think Jelly Bean was the new OS when I started. I started about a year after I graduated college. I was a physics major, so totally unrelated.
Oh.
Had done a little bit of coding for physics labs and such, but no actual software development. Started working on an iPhone app just as a fun project right around the time that I was moving to the Bay Area from Portland at the time. And I was talking to a friend who was a software developer in the Bay Area, and he was like, "Oh yeah, you could totally get a job at a startup." I was like, "No way, I really highly doubt that." But I was not really aware of the startup ecosystem and massive demand for mobile developers at the time. So started off as an intern at this really, really small startup that's no longer around. Started off working on iOS and then switched over to Android. And then from there, it was just, full-time Android.
Am I remembering the name of the app right? It was called Avocado?
No, this was actually before Avocado. This was another startup called Hollerback, which was basically async video messaging, similar to like Snapchat, I guess. Although I don't use Snapchat. I think that's what Snapchat is. Yeah.
It's what the kids tell us these days.
Yeah. You could record a video and send it to someone without having to be in a live chat. So that was cool. It didn't end up working out. It was really small, like angel funded, 4 or 5 people startup.
So you decided to take a break and then work on your own project for some time, right? And this is called Sessions, if I understand right. So can you tell us like what you've been up to recently? Yeah.
So as Don said, I worked at American Express. With him, I was there for about 2.5 years. And then in May of this year, I left to kind of pursue something that I'd been really hoping to do at some point in my career. Figured this was as good a time as any. So I left in May to start building my own app. It's easier than ever to write an app with a backend without having to like know everything about building backends. So we can talk about Firebase a bit and the process of building an app from scratch. But yeah, Sessions is an app that I had an idea for about a year ago and had been working on kind of as a side project while I was at Amex. It's just an app for musicians to track and share their practice sessions.
Does your application, the Sessions app that you wrote, is it just an Android-only application, since that's what your background seems to mainly be in?
Yeah, my background is primarily Android, but this project was also an opportunity for me to learn iOS and build an iOS app. I had a tiny bit of experience at the very beginning of my career working on iOS, so it's not completely foreign, although I did have to kind of learn Swift from scratch. And I think when you're building a consumer app, you really want to have as many users as possible. You want to maximize revenue and all that stuff. So I thought it was important to build on both platforms.
And you went the native route, right? You didn't necessarily try something like Flutter, which would give you that benefit automatically.
Yeah, that's correct. my kind of reasoning was that writing code is not necessarily the biggest usage of time in building a project. Things like higher level architecture, design, building your data model, organizing data flow within the app. That stuff is like the biggest usage of time. So actually implementing it and writing the code is not the biggest roadblock. And I kind of figured that if I could use a similar architecture and use similar language constructs from Android and iOS, then I would be able to basically write on Android. Something might take 6 hours, and then once I'm really streamlined in this like shared architecture, shared language stuff, then maybe the iOS implementation would only take an hour or 2 hours. In practice, it's probably been more like 50%. So if something takes 6 hours on Android, then I can kind of copy it over to iOS in about half the time. And maybe I could get better savings with something like Flutter or React Native, but those have a ton of other costs.
So when you first decided to hop over and start creating your own application, I think it was Sessions is what you called it. What was the driver to create this app? And I guess more put it a different way is like, what does the app do? What's its main function, and where does it kind of fit within the market?
So I got a lot of inspiration from running tracker apps like Strava. So I'm an avid runner, and I'm on Strava. I probably check that app 10 times a day. And since I started running seriously, I've been using that app consistently to track my runs and be able to share with friends and other athletes that I follow. And I kind of realized that as I was picking up guitar, trying to learn a new instrument, and I've also played drums for most of my life. There wasn't really an analog for Strava for music. So as I've learned in playing music for most of my life, you really need to practice consistently and hold yourself accountable, and want to practice even when you don't really feel like it. And I think for some people, myself included, keeping a detailed log and being able to have that be public can really serve as a source of accountability and motivation and inspiration. So I kind of built it for myself with the broader goal of having it be useful for lots of people.
During your development of this, so it looks like you've went into Android and iOS, and for Sessions, as you said, you're building both platforms. Did you have any inspiration during this, or was it just kind of one of those things like, I just want to try to go build an app by myself and see if I can do it? Or have you kind of been following along anyone else's footsteps, or kind of following or reading any literature, podcasts, et cetera, that have kind of got you thinking in that mindset? Because there's a lot of folks out there that probably have an idea, but just don't know where to go for inspiration. And I'm wondering if you had any along the way.
Yeah, so I had always kind of heard of this idea of being an indie app developer, but sort of thought that maybe that was out of reach or just not financially viable. And we can get into the financial viability stuff. Turns out that's not actually like the main goal of this project or the biggest takeaway or anything like that. But yeah, lots of inspiration from people like, I think his name is Chris Lacey, who built Action Launcher, which is a massively popular Android app. And I think he's able to support himself through that project. Although I think a lot of people also supplement their indie app development with consulting. It sounds like maybe you do something like that, Don. And this idea of being a self-sufficient software developer has become pretty popular lately, not just with mobile apps. I think if you really want to make your own software business and be self-sufficient, maybe making like an internet SaaS company where you can sell marketing automation software to tech companies, something like that is probably more financially viable. There's a lot of stories of people like that. I listen to this one podcast called Indie Hackers quite a bit. tons of stories of people leaving their jobs to take their side project full time and end up being massively successful. So that was kind of the pipe dream, and realizing that the odds of something like that are pretty low. But even if it didn't work out and make me an instant millionaire, there would be lots of goals on the side that I could accomplish. Just like furthering my experience in mobile development, learning lots of stuff. Designing a backend. So yeah, lots of sub goals that I think have been accomplished.
So I kind of want to unravel that just for a second before we hop into some of the tech challenges that you had. You said something about it wasn't a monetary decision, but I would love to learn kind of what your drive for this project was. Was it, like you said, to just learn something new, to challenge yourself, given a specific period of time that you had available to do that? And if that was, what did that look like for you, not making money at a full-time job? Did you have to have a nest egg saved up? Or were you hoping maybe that this would turn into something financial, but you just had a time frame that you had to get it done to make a decision? I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, great question. I do think you need to have some financial stability, like you said, a nest egg where you can take, 3 months minimum, probably more like 6 months up to maybe a year. So it's important to start thinking about those timeframes and how long you can support yourself with minimal or no income. As far as goals of the project and reasons for going out on my own, I thought it's really important as a software developer to have knowledge of the full, software development lifecycle, like the broader scope of where you fit into the picture. So working full time at a company with a 30-person Android team, you're going to be building new features and you're going to have a lot of impact, but you might not have the experience of designing a complete backend, your full data model for a production app. You might not go through the experience of publishing an app to the Google Play Store or dealing with rejections from the App Store. And design, marketing, this whole product lifecycle. I really wanted to kind of push myself and widen the scope of expertise for my for my career.
I think that's kind of a good transition for us here. Is that you developed this application? You came from an Android background. And so I'm going to take a guess here, and I don't really know the answer to this question, so full disclosure, I imagine that you're probably using Kotlin. Is that correct on the Android app?
Yes, that's correct.
So when you're using Kotlin, it was kind of probably second nature to you. You've probably been using it for a while. Now, when you wanted to start making the iOS app, at what point did you think like, all right, I'm guessing here, but I'm imagining you probably built out part of the Android app first, and then you said, all right, I'm going to create the iOS app. And how did you go about thinking about that, saying, all right, well, I know I have a market that's going to need this app for iOS. I'm going to get asked about it. How did you determine that you're going to write this in Swift versus any other type of shared platform? And kind of what was it like to get started in that other area since you hadn't been involved in it in a long time?
Yeah, and a quick follow-up to that too. Like why? Because I know Swift is the equivalent new language, and Objective-C was the original language with iOS, right? So where can you give us like your thought process as to how you started off on that side?
Yeah, so just a few years ago, it was all Java on Android and Objective-C on iOS. And maybe that's the reason that we have Android developers and iOS developers today. These languages are quite different. But I think the platform languages have kind of converged to this like object-oriented with some functional aspects, sort of modern languages like Kotlin and Swift. And my idea was these languages are similar enough where, I can, like Don said, write the app in Kotlin on Android and then kind of just copy that over to Swift, substituting val for let and adding some other like Swift language constructs like if, let, and stuff like that that you don't have in Kotlin. But yeah, these languages are close enough where I could look at some Kotlin code and then easily conceptualize what that would look like on Swift. One thing I didn't totally realize or think about was there are a lot of other differences between Android and iOS. Like the memory management is different. The UI builder interface is different. So on Android, you're dealing with XML or the new layout editor. And on iOS, you're using interface builder or even building views programmatically. The way that views are created is a little bit different. And then there's platform stuff like cameras and databases are going to be different. But I think there's more in common than there is different.
So I had a couple of follow-up questions to that. You said, okay, so you could conceptualize what the code would look like in Swift, right? But before you even decided to start on the iOS app, did you take like a bootcamp course or something? Did you start or did you just like wing it saying, nope, I think I have a decent enough handle of this? Or did you, maybe do one of like the bootstrap applications where you built like a Hello World iOS application, and from there, once you got a little familiar with the territory, did you decide to like work on the iOS app, like on the Sessions iOS app? Or was it just like, nope, I am going to dive straight in after building like a version of the Android app?
Yeah. I'm not sure if I can really back this up with data, but I'm actually pretty anti boot camp. Like when I was learning Kotlin, I didn't really do any Kotlin tutorials. I just started writing it. I mean, obviously you have to have like some idea of what you're writing. So there is going to be, a lot of having Google and Stack Overflow open as you're writing code. But yeah, I didn't do any Hello World or anything. I just jumped right in.
Oh, nice. So you just like, new project on app code or Xcode or whatever, and then just like found your way?
Yeah, correct. Yeah.
I like it.
Yeah, it's an iterative process, right? Yeah. You're not going to get everything right on the first try. But you iterate, right? Code is fluid. You can change things, and yeah.
What were some of the challenges that you encountered initially that were just kind of that threw you for a loop?
The biggest one, and I think I tweeted about this, was garbage collection on the JVM works different from how memory is managed on the iOS runtime. So I think you guys did an episode about this. In Java and Kotlin, you have this like tree of objects, and if you have like an object tree that is not referenced anywhere else, then the garbage collection algorithm, which uses something called mark and sweep, I think, will mark those as unused and then sweep them away into the garbage. That's my very primitive understanding of JVM garbage collection. Whereas on iOS, I think this is a property of the runtime. I'm not sure what that runtime is called. Maybe Objective-C runtime, something like that. There's this reference counting model where an object is released to be cleaned up if there are no references to that object. And what that means is if two objects reference each other but are on an island, so no other objects are referencing them, then they still will each have a reference count of 1, and they will force each other to be kept around, which is not something that happens in Java and Kotlin. So for example, if you have something called a data source in iOS, which is the equivalent of an adapter on Android, and you have a view controller that references this data source as a child object, and then the data source has a like reference to a callback, which is like a lambda that you pass in from the view controller, and the lambda block references the view controller. So the data source then has a reference to the view controller. This will actually cause a retain cycle, is I think what it's called, where basically they're keeping each other's reference count at 1, and then even if you navigate to another view controller, they will not be released. So you have to, there's this like little block you put at the top of your Lambda, which says weak self or unowned self. They're basically the same thing, which says, this is a weak reference and don't, let's see, I guess it says don't keep this around, don't count this as a reference. So when I released the app on iOS, I was seeing a ton of out of memory errors, like 20 or 30% of users, which is really quite bad. But at the time, there were only 20 or 30 users when I first released it, so I was able to figure that out pretty quickly. Not too many issues after I figured that out.
And the weak and unowned self is something that also, because previously when I've looked at Objective-C code, that stuff is like littered all over the place, right? But Swift also has this notion where you have to mention that it's weak or unowned.
Yeah, it's kind of gross. And I think for people that aren't familiar with, how that works, it can be really weird and sort of daunting. So I think we have it pretty good on the JVM where we don't have to worry about that stuff. I think garbage collection is pretty cool. Although I guess it has its drawbacks,
Yeah, that's true. And for folks who are interested, I think it's episode 64 where we talked about this. And we'll add a link in the show notes to sort of that, so you can take a look. The other thing I wanted to ask is about Interface Builder. I've worked with my iOS colleagues and they keep mentioning how much they hate or love Interface Builder. Can you give us a rundown of what this is? What is the Android equivalent, right? Do we have something like this? What are the layouts that we use? Is there an equivalent of constraint layout, which is what most of us want to use these days? Can you give us a rundown on that?
Yeah. So there is an analog in Android, which is just the layout editor, which is part of Android Studio. But I don't even use the layout editor on Android. I just use XML. The XML is so readable on Android and so configurable that I've just become more comfortable with that. And then I just switch over. There's a shortcut. I think it's Shift Control Arrow. Will hop you over to the layout editor, and you can make sure your XML is correct. But on iOS, it's very common just to edit your UIs through the Interface Builder UI itself, which is basically this drag and drop user interface where you're dragging edges to other edges and setting up constraints. So recently on Android, we've been given constraint layout, and the analog on iOS is what's called auto layout, although it's not quite the same because constraint layout on Android is like a view group, whereas auto layout is just something you can use on all views. I am not an expert. Now that I start talking about that, I imagine auto layout stuff is sprinkled into all views. And I think more generally, Android has this concept of view groups, which can have children. And on iOS, I think any view can have children, I believe, or subviews is what they call them. So there are some differences there, just in terminology and conceptualizing this stuff. They're similar, but there are plenty of differences between the two platforms.
Do you remember any of the specific idiosyncrasies? For the basic widgets that we typically tend to use, was there something that just threw you off saying, I never knew that was the default, in iOS? I asked because maybe that's something that would be interesting for us, right? As Android developers, or if we have to take the Android platform further, there's always things we can learn from the other platforms, right?
Yeah. So I think when we finally have a cross-platform mobile development solution, everyone will breathe a massive sigh of relief because we don't have to worry about this stuff anymore. On Android, there are so many things on Android, right, which are weird little XML attributes that you have to know about to get your view to be clickable, or clip to bounds or whatever. And iOS has just as many of those, or more. So for example, in constraint layout, you need your heights to be defined if you want the layout to be solvable. And if something is scrollable, then that counts as like a flexible height, and that'll expand or contract to fit the available space. On iOS, the Uitextview class, which is also something that's specific to iOS, because on Android we have text view and edit text. On iOS, there's UI label, UI text field, and UI text view. So there's 3, or maybe even more. And a UI text view is scrollable by default. So its height is not constrained, so the layout can't be solved unless your UI text view is set to have a flexible height. So I kept seeing these errors, like not enough constraints, the layout isn't specified enough, and I was like, what is the issue? I can't figure out what's wrong. And there's this like checkbox. So on Android, you have to learn all these XML attributes. On iOS and Interface Builder, it's checkboxes in the UI or dropdowns. And there's like 5 panels for every view, and each panel has 20 checkboxes or attributes. So yeah, there's like 100 things. Yeah.
You said something earlier that kind of like piques my interest. You have, we're kind of talking about the differences between the different layouts and the commonalities between them and so forth. But you said something earlier on where you're trying to share like your architecture and, kind of share some code between Kotlin and, Swift. So you wanted to implement something in Android, it would take you 6 hours. And then to replicate it was, 2 to 3 hours inside of iOS. I'm wondering how you were doing that, because you said you're not using anything like Flutter, you're not using React Native, you're actually writing the raw code. So I'm wondering if you could tell me and the listeners how you went about sharing the code or the style of code or the architecture between iOS and Android.
Yeah, of course. So kind of already discussed the fact that the languages are pretty similar, and the UI platforms, I guess, are also sort of similar between constraint layout and auto layout. And view hierarchies and stuff are going to be pretty similar. There's a lot of other stuff that I was able to kind of leverage to minimize the duplicate development time on 2 platforms. I did try to use a shared architecture, both at the application level in terms of having multiple modules and having this like dependency tree of feature modules and libraries and stuff. But then on a more micro level, like at the UI layer, I took this Android architecture that I'm familiar with, which is like MVI or MVP, basically like a view or a fragment with a presenter, and then the view is emitting events with RxJava, and you're mapping these events to asynchronous network calls to get some data or update some data, and then taking the result of that, mapping it to some value type that we can use to populate the UI. So there's this architecture of a fragment and a presenter, and then like some other database client or a network client, and that kind of transformation code is like an RxJava stream, and we can replicate this whole stack basically on iOS. No one really uses presenters on iOS, but there's no reason you can't. So on iOS, maybe they would call that a view model, but I just called it a presenter. Using RxSwift basically as the analog to RxJava, which is very, very close. They have almost all of the same operators. And then, the Firebase libraries. So like I said, I'm using Firebase. The Firebase APIs on Android and iOS are also nearly identical. So this whole like data flow and UI pattern is almost identical on Android and iOS. And like where I'm using fragments, I can use a view controller. There are some drawbacks with this. So like we can't really use platform specific stuff like the new Android architecture components. Like there's no view model and live data, nothing like that on iOS. So I'm not using that stuff, even though I would probably like to. And then there are also some other strategies for like, I guess, I've called it code sharing in a blog post. Although it's not really code sharing. I don't want to give anyone the wrong idea. There's also some similar libraries. For example, on Android, we have RecyclerView and diffutil for updating lists with data and being able to calculate a def and apply that. I don't think iOS has anything like that in the platform beyond just UI table view and UI collection view. So there's this library I found called differ, which calculates a diff, and it can apply it to a UI table view or collection view. But the APIs are a little different, so you can write your own extension functions so that you're actually creating almost identical APIs between libraries on two different platforms. And I was able to find a few libraries that could kind of create this like nearly identical code on each platform. But yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, is there like an equivalent to Dagger's dependency injection? Because I know I saw this some of the tweets that you sent.
No, that's a good question. I didn't really research dependency injection on iOS too much. I don't think there's any equivalent to Dagger. I'm not sure why. I'm not really enough of an expert on the Swift language to like tell you if someone could implement Dagger on Swift. I imagine there are some differences and issues that would maybe prevent that. So like, I'm not really doing dependency injection. Like, in the canonical Dagger example where you're creating,
right.
You're calling new inside your class, right, for all its dependencies. On Android, I'm using Dagger, but on iOS, I'm just doing that. I'm like, there's no dependency injection at all. So, I mean, if I wanted to, continue developing and growing this app, which hopefully I will, maybe I can make some kind of migration like that. Yeah.
The other thing I've heard from the iOS folks as well is I think the way the architecture is set up is that you actually don't maybe need, don't meaning you don't need a library per se, because I think you do have access to the constructor for those view controllers, which I think is the equivalent for like activities or fragments that we have. And I'm out of my depth here, so I don't necessarily know, but I've heard that you don't actually even need something like Dagger because you just get access to the constructors, and somehow the lifecycle is like maintained. But I mean, I have no clue what. Yeah,
I'm not sure you do actually if you create something from what you call a nib, like an interface builder file. I'd probably have to double check that. But yeah, it's almost like the equivalent of view inflation. So you're not always going to be able to just pass stuff into the constructor. Although you can like, just like with fragments, like you can create that instance through inflation or whatever process, and then just like set variables that are mutable in that class, which is not ideal, but it works.
Got it. I mean, so we've been talking about some of the iOS stuff. I'm actually now curious, given that we are an Android developer podcast, how the Android stuff worked specifically for like Sessions, the app. One thing Don and I have like repeatedly talked over time is like how the audio latency piece is a little tricky. At least it definitely was in the early days with Android. Is that something that you had to deal with, or is Sessions more about just tracking specific? Like, did you have an audio piece where you were recording some of like the sessions that you were creating, or was that something you were able to avoid with your use case?
Yeah, good point. Sessions does not have an audio or video piece right now. I was planning on adding that, but most of the feedback I've gotten from users in terms of feature requests and like the direction people want the app to go, I found that some people want that video stuff, but it seems like most people really want just like time tracking. They want basically a like detailed calendar of their practice. So it's more of a note taking and personal accountability tool versus audio sharing. I will say from experience, the very first iOS project I built was an app for drummers to measure their accuracy. So you could like play a small passage, and then there was this, I guess you could call it an algorithm to match that up to what the ideal timing would be, and then basically calculate a score from 0 to 100. And I tried starting to build that on Android, and I couldn't even get like, there's on the iOS app, there's four clicks of like an audio sample, and then you start playing and it measures that. I couldn't even get the 4 clicks to line up and sound good on Android. So, I mean, there's all these like native libraries and C++ and stuff that you can do to optimize the Android audio pipeline, but it was way over my head at the time. So yeah, I am a little nervous about trying to implement audio on Android, which I might do in the future. Yeah.
Interesting. Well, so before we move on to like some of the other stuff, are there like any parting tips? Like, I know you've been working with Android development, but were there certain things that jumped out as you worked on your own project? Like, were there things that you wanted to call out? Any tips that you had that you can like share with the listeners?
Yeah, I would say really think about the value of the decisions that you make. And don't just try to follow patterns because it's conventional wisdom. For example, if you're going to write tests, really make sure that the tests are serving a purpose, whether that's, helping you organize your code better or increasing reliability. No need to write complicated UI tests if your UI is going to be constantly changing, or if it's very easy to test your app's UI manually. My app is not that big. I can kind of step through the entire thing in 15 minutes. And I change it so often that I haven't actually written any UI tests. Don't tell my old team at American Express, Don. Yeah, there are some unit tests for things like mapping data, all the business logic associated with the UI. Just because, I'm not going to argue the value of unit tests. I think we all agree those can be really valuable. Just make sure like you're not just following some pattern because that's the way that you think it has to be done.
So I'd like to ask a question here to get your take on this. Now, you've built an Android application, you have an iOS application, you've made multiple updates to both of them. When you want to make a change to a screen or something, you have to go do it in 2 places now. Knowing what you know now about Android and iOS and building this product as a developer and someone who also has to market the product and so forth, and given your limited time, would you make the same decision again to build this twice, each on both platforms, or would you end up using a different solution like React Native or Flutter or anything like that?
That's hard to say. I think I would probably do it again. Yeah, I've heard negatives about React Native that kind of turned me off about that. Flutter is interesting. I don't know that much about it. I suppose if you are just using it for your UI, that could be really awesome. Since one of the biggest differences between iOS and Android is the UI piece. Also, I think it'd be very cool to be able to use Kotlin native or multi-platform, whatever you call it. It is, even though the code is so similar, like this, RX Java, RX Swift mapping pipeline, the code is so similar, but still it's annoying to have to write it twice. So yeah, if you could just write once, write once, deploy everywhere, that would be amazing. I don't think there really is an ideal solution for like the full native stack, avoiding code duplication. And I think that's why so many software teams are still, pursuing native on both platforms. Hopefully we can move past this, but I'm not sure how long that's going to take.
One of the things that I think, regardless of if you're using a tool like Flutter, React Native Android or native iOS, and you have an application like this, you need some sort of backend. And you mentioned this before. One of the things that you wanted to learn during the development of the Sessions app was, how do I build a backend? How do I model that data? How do I store it? How do I retrieve it? All of that stuff that you've never done before. And you mentioned that you decided to work with Firebase. And so I wanted to kind of understand, for the listeners who aren't using Firebase, what Firebase services are you using, and how have they helped you with the Sessions app?
Yeah, so I first started hearing about Firebase maybe 2 or 3 years ago, and that really got the wheels turning in my head about the idea of being able to build apps completely on my own. So Firebase, if listeners are not familiar, basically is like a backend as a service, provides all this stuff basically out of the box and corresponding client libraries on Android and iOS for getting and setting data on your backend. So the specific Firebase services I am using are Auth, Firestore, Cloud Functions, which is similar to AWS Lambda, basically like a key component of this serverless architecture. There's Firebase Analytics, dynamic links for sending users invitations and being able to track those clicks. And then cloud messaging is also now part of Firebase, which is basically push notifications.
Interesting. Can you talk to us a little about like the cloud function stuff? Exactly. Like you said, serverless architecture. Can you like maybe give us like a minute? Because I think it's a super interesting concept. Can you give us like a quick gist on what that is?
So my understanding is that if you're writing normal backend code for a REST API, you might have a function corresponding to like a GET request to get a list of a user's sessions, or a put or put for updating data on the backend. And when that put function is called, you can do other stuff in addition to just adding data to that corresponding database row. You could, in that function, like perform another query, get a list of a user's followers, and then propagate that new data to all of their followers. So you end up being able to kind of customize the logic of, each endpoint can have all these other various effects on your backend. But with Firebase, you don't get to write your own get and put functions. You're just basically calling set value in a client library, and that just updates your backend database. So the serverless model, which is not really serverless, there's still a server, is to have these like functions that trigger when certain events happen. For example, when an entity in your database is updated or deleted or created, you can trigger a function that then propagates that change or updates data in some auxiliary database that you use for search. So I have probably maybe 15 functions or maybe 20 that trigger on various events and do stuff like I mentioned, like propagating changes to followers, which you could do on the client also, but might not be very efficient. For example, like if you had Justin Bieber was on the app, you might have like 10 million followers, and that's not really, you can't really do that stuff on the client. So you have to have these like functions that trigger to propagate these changes.
All right. So I guess we've been talking a lot about like Firebase and stuff. Can you quickly maybe tell us some of like the challenges that you had using Firebase?
Yeah, I'd say the biggest challenges haven't been with the Firebase platform itself, and more just general challenges of creating a backend for a production app. The biggest challenge, and probably the biggest challenge of this whole project, has been designing a data model that works and is fast and doesn't require like thousands of queries just to like get some data for a screen. Firebase is a little bit unique, or I should say Firestore is their database product that I've been using. It's a bit different from this model of tables with rows and columns in what we call a relational database. So Firebase is a document-oriented database similar to NoSQL or NoSQL. So there's documents and collections. So you might have a user document, and then there will be child collections, like a collection for their personal sessions, or like all of their notifications, or like their social feed, and figuring out a way to model stuff like comments and likes on a user's sessions, and being able to show those on a user's profile, and then have those visible in all of that user's followers' social feeds. That stuff can get pretty complicated. And it might be easy to build a trivial example with 10 users, but when you start thinking about scaling and making duplicate network calls when you shouldn't, that stuff can get really difficult. So that's been a huge learning experience for me, and I think I've really leveled up in terms of thinking about designing APIs for backends.
So, other than some tech stuff that we've talked about here quite a bit, what's been some of the most challenging aspects of being an indie developer?
I would say it's important to have a plan on what your goals are for the project. For example, I started off with this project thinking I want to never work at a company again, and I want to be self-sufficient and make some, people call it passive income, but it's not really passive because you're working on it. I thought it would be very cool to just have this recurring income and this awesome app with, millions of users. So I spent a lot of time kind of earlier on in, after releasing the app, I spent a lot of time on Facebook ads and Google search ads, and the iOS App Store has search ads. I spent a bunch of time trying to optimize that stuff, and trying to get as many users as possible. But then I realized that based on performance of the app and how I was feeling about it, and kind of taking a step back and reevaluating what I was doing, getting a bunch of users was not the best immediate goal for me. I think if you really, really are committing to this goal of being a self-sufficient software developer, I think that stuff is important. But the other goals, like becoming a better engineer, building something from scratch, being able to own the whole product lifecycle, and kind of accomplish this goal of creating a product on your own, and leveling up in your career, that kind of eclipsed the original goal of being self-sufficient. So kind of reevaluated and sort of shifted my focus back to developing the actual product and making sure that the software was as good as possible, and realizing that based on the data I had seen, it was becoming increasingly unlikely that I was going to be able to actually support myself based on future income from this app. So I would say don't go crazy worrying about marketing if your goal is just to build an app and level up in your career.
That's very good. It's good advice.
So Matt, what's next for you? It sounds like you've taken a break, and at this point you basically want to move on to something else. What's next for you?
Yeah, that's pretty much correct. I have sort of realized that as much as I have enjoyed building this app and as valuable of an experience that it has been, my future lies, at least in the next few years, in working for companies and getting a paycheck. So I have spent the last month or so interviewing. I'm going to be starting at Lyft in a couple weeks, so I'm really excited about that.
Congratulations!
And the goal is to be able to, thank you. I would love to be able to keep this Sessions app going as a side project, maybe working on it a couple hours a week, releasing an update maybe once a month or once every couple of months instead of every week or two.
And it also goes to show where we are fortunate enough to live in a time where you can have a change of heart with how you want to go and still land up in a good place, right?
Yeah, at the end of the day, we're all, Android developers in 2018, right? I think if you're in a situation where you live in a city with a lot of tech companies and you have a few years of experience and you feel like your interviewing skills and engineering skills are decent enough, then there's not actually a whole lot of risk, right, in leaving a paying job, which is just a really fortunate situation to be in.
No, I liked that you separated interviewing skills and engineering skills.
Yeah, right. Yeah, that was maybe a unconscious slip, but yeah, they're a little different. Although kudos to Lyft on their interview process. It was really good.
All right, Matt, thank you so much. I think we have had a very interesting sort of conversation about indie development and just diving in a little to see what the differences are between iOS and Android. We'll make sure to add a link to all the resources that you mentioned, to your app sessions. Everyone should go, if you're listening, go and download the app and make sure you let Matt know how awesome the app is. Or if you're interested in music, definitely do that. If folks want to reach out to you, what would be a good way to do that?
I'm on Twitter. My name is _Matt Logan. Also, you can email me. We'll put my email in the show notes. Yeah, I would love to chat with anyone who is thinking about leaving their job to be an independent developer. There's a lot of other kind of business and stuff that you need to kind of set up to be able to do this without worrying about getting sued and stuff like that. So happy to talk details or code. Feel free to reach out.
And Don, I hear from your family that you've been taking the house down with your drumming techniques. So if folks want to follow you, what would be a good way to do that?
They can follow me on Twitter or Instagram, and that's at Don Felker if you want to see me lay down some sick beats. Kaushik, if folks want to see you tear it up on skins, what's the best way to get a hold of you?
Twitter as well, Kaushik Gopal on Twitter, and the same handle on Instagram. So those are two good ways to reach out to me. Thank you all so much for listening. Matt, once again, thank you so much for coming on the show and talking to us about what you've been up to. This was a lot of fun.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you all for listening, and we will catch you in the next episode.
Once again, we'd like to thank American Express for sponsoring today's episode. If you're interested in joining one of the best Android teams out there, please follow the link in the show notes and go ahead and tell them that I sent you. Looking forward to hearing from you soon.
I also want to thank Nevercode for sponsoring the show. Nevercode is a CI service that's one of the first that's taking the Flutter revolution pretty seriously. You can head on over to nevercode.io for a 14-day free trial. They also have a bunch of interesting resources for mobile app development over at their blog, nevercode.io/blog. My thanks to Nevercode again for sponsoring the show. That's it for the show, folks. Fragmented is hosted by Don Felker and me, Kaushik Gopal. We edit and produce all the episodes here on Fragmented. Sarah the Amazing Jackson from the Spec Network helps with production assistance and wraps our final mix. Our theme and ad music is by the national recording artist Blueprint from Weightless Recordings. You can find more Fragmented episodes at fragmentedpodcast.com. Thanks for listening, and we will catch you in the next episode.